Paying for my stepdaughter's dream wedding was supposed to be a proud moment, but it quickly felt like a nightmare. Instead of sharing the day with me, she spent the reception celebrating with her real dad who hadn't contributed a dime. I sat there in silence, feeling completely used while they laughed together. Finally, she walked over to my table and handed me a folded piece of paper she called a bill. I couldn't believe the audacity of asking for more money. I looked down at the paper expecting the worst, but what I saw written there changed absolutely everything. The church doors opened wide to admit the steady stream of well-dressed attendees. Robert stood near the entrance and smoothed the silk fabric of his tie with a nervous hand. He greeted the arriving family members and directed them toward the waiting ushers. The wooden pews filled up quickly with chatting friends and relatives from both sides of the aisle. The expensive floral arrangements looked stunning against the white altar. It was finally time for the ceremony to begin. Just as the organ music started, a familiar figure strutted down the center aisle. Greg made his way to the very front and sat down right next to Sarah's mother. He acted as if he belonged there in the seat of honor. Robert felt his jaw tighten as he watched the man settle in comfortably. Greg hadn't sent a single check to help with the wedding costs, yet here he was, taking the prime spot usually reserved for the father of the bride. The wedding march began to play loudly throughout the sanctuary. Everyone stood up and turned their heads toward the back of the church. Sarah appeared in the doorway looking beautiful in her white lace gown. However, Robert's heart sank when he saw who was standing beside her. She gripped Greg's arm tightly as they began their slow walk toward the altar. Robert stood alone near the side pillar, watching the pair move past him without a glance. The procession reached the front of the church, and the guests began to sit down again. Robert moved away from his standing position and found his assigned spot. He slid into the empty space on the second row, directly behind Greg. It felt humiliating to sit there like a distant relative instead of the man who raised her. He kept his head high and focused his eyes on the priest. Nobody seemed to notice his exclusion from the front bench. The priest began the service with a standard opening prayer. Robert craned his neck to see past Greg's broad shoulders. He could barely see Sarah's face as she recited her vows to her fiancé. The exchange of rings happened faster than he expected. Before he knew it, the couple shared their first kiss as husband and wife. Robert clapped along with everyone else, though his view remained blocked by the man in front of him. The crowd moved from the church to the grand reception hall across town. Waiters in black vests circulated through the room with silver trays of appetizers. Guests found their name cards and took their seats at the round tables. The kitchen staff brought out the first course of the lavish meal Robert had funded. The clinking of silverware against fine china filled the air. Robert sat down and watched the servers pour expensive wine for the head table. A spoon tapped against a champagne glass, signaling the start of the speeches. Greg stood up from his seat next to the bride and grabbed the microphone. He spoke loudly about how proud he was to give his daughter this beautiful wedding. He detailed the planning process as if he had been there for every decision. The guests nodded and smiled at his charming words. He raised his glass high and accepted the applause that was rightfully meant for someone else. The applause for Greg died down, and the dinner service continued. Robert gripped his glass of ice water until his knuckles turned white. He did not join in the toast or drink the champagne. The steak on his plate went untouched as he stared at the tablecloth. A few guests glanced his way, but no one came over to speak to him. He felt completely invisible in a room full of people he had fed and entertained. The party moved onto the dance floor as the evening progressed. Sarah stayed close to Greg, laughing hysterically at every story he told. They danced several songs together while the photographer snapped countless pictures. Robert watched the clock on the wall tick by, hour after agonizing hour. She had not looked in his direction once since the reception began. It seemed as though she had forgotten he was even in the building. The DJ slowed down the tempo for a ballad. Sarah suddenly stopped dancing and whispered something to her new husband. She smoothed her dress and began to walk across the room. Her path led straight toward the back corner where Robert sat alone. His heart began to race as she got closer to his table. The other guests turned in their chairs to watch the bride move through the crowd. She arrived at his table and stood silently for a moment. Her expression was serious as she looked down at him. She reached into the hidden pocket of her wedding gown. Her hand emerged holding a small, folded piece of white paper. Robert stiffened in his chair, unsure of what was happening. She held the paper out toward him without saying a word. The room seemed to grow quieter, though the music still played. Robert reached out his hand and took the note from her fingers. The paper felt heavy with significance as he held it. Sarah simply nodded at him, encouraging him to open it right there. He hesitated for a second, wondering if this was another bill or a demand. Finally, he prepared himself for whatever message she had decided to deliver. His fingers trembled slightly as he undid the folds of the paper. He flattened the sheet against the tablecloth to read it clearly. The handwriting was neat and familiar, written in bold black ink. He started at the top of the page and read down line by line. It looked like an itemized list of expenses at first glance. He squinted to make sure he was reading the words correctly. I noticed the paper was formatted like a receipt, listing things like tuition and hugs, but the final total due was simply written as love. The list detailed years of support, from childhood braces to college textbooks. Every sacrifice he had ever made was accounted for on the page. At the bottom, where a dollar amount should have been, was that single powerful word. It wasn't a bill for the wedding at all. It was an acknowledgement of everything he had done. Tears welled up in Robert's eyes as the meaning sank in. He lifted his head to look at his stepdaughter standing before him. Her serious expression had melted into a warm, tearful smile. She looked at him with a depth of affection he hadn't seen all day. The tension in his shoulders instantly evaporated. He realized completely that he had misunderstood her intentions for the entire event. Sarah turned away from the table and faced the DJ booth. She made a cutting motion across her throat with her hand. The music cut out abruptly, leaving a sudden silence in the hall. The guests stopped their conversations and looked toward the bride. The atmosphere in the room shifted from festive to attentive. She was preparing to make a public statement. A hush fell over the crowd as Sarah walked to the center of the room. She grabbed the wireless microphone from its stand near the dance floor. Her voice echoed slightly as she asked for everyone to listen. She apologized for interrupting the party, but said she had something important to do. All eyes were fixed on her, waiting to hear what she had to say. Robert sat still, clutching the receipt in his hand. Across the room, Greg lowered his drink and frowned. He looked around the hall, clearly unsure of what was happening. He took a step forward as if assuming the speech was about him. His confident demeanor from earlier began to fade. He glanced between Sarah and Robert with a puzzled expression. It was clear he had not been part of this particular plan. Sarah pointed directly at Robert and asked him to join her. She announced his name clearly over the speakers for everyone to hear. The guests turned their heads to follow her gesture. Robert stood up slowly, his legs feeling a bit shaky. He navigated through the tables and walked toward where she stood. The room remained silent, watching the interaction with intense curiosity. He climbed the short steps to the elevated platform where the head table sat. Sarah reached out and took his hand as he arrived next to her. Standing there, looking out at the crowd, he felt a surge of emotion. She squeezed his hand tight, reassuring him in front of everyone. He stood tall, no longer feeling like an outsider at his own event. She was finally acknowledging his presence. Sarah reached behind the small podium and retrieved a large, flat object. It was a thick manila envelope, sealed and official-looking. She turned to Robert and placed it firmly in his hands. He looked at the package, wondering what else she could possibly give him. The weight of the envelope suggested it contained many pages. She nodded for him to open it right then and there. Robert undid the metal clasp and slid his hand inside. He pulled out a thick stack of papers clipped together. The header on the front page was printed in bold, legal font. He recognized the terminology immediately as he scanned the first paragraph. His hands began to shake even harder than before. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes wide with shock and understanding. She presented me with adoption papers, revealing that she only considered me her real father and wanted to make our bond legal and permanent. Even though she was an adult, she wanted the world to know who her dad really was. The documents were already signed by her, just waiting for his signature. She spoke into the microphone, telling the guests that DNA didn't make a father, love did. This was the gift she had been saving for this moment. Someone handed Robert a pen from the guest book table. He bent over the table and signed his name on the designated line. As he lifted the pen, the room erupted in thunderous applause. Guests stood up and cheered for the emotional moment they had just witnessed. Sarah hugged him tightly, burying her face in his shoulder. It was the proudest moment of his entire life. While the room celebrated the new legal family, Greg stood alone near the wall. He realized his show of bravado had been completely undermined. Nobody was looking at him or offering him congratulations anymore. He set his drink down on a tray and turned toward the rear doors. He slipped out into the night, leaving the reception hall in silence. Robert and his daughter celebrated, finally united as they should have been all along.